He recalled the reading in the Acts of the Apostles, how after Christ's ascension into heaven, all were united and persevering in prayer together with Mary. And the Cardinal said that all gathered here today are praying together, as well as just a few hours before the start of the conclave, under the gaze of Our Lady beside the altar, in this Basilica, he said, which rises above the tomb of the Apostle Peter. Professor Prudler, how important is this element?
It's irreducible. I mean, the selection, we saw that with the prayers at the entrance of the conclave. We saw it with the Missa Pro Leggendo this morning. The intoning of the Veni Sancti Spiritus, the invocation of the Holy Spirit on the work of the conclave. But it's also important that we remember, as the Holy Spirit guides and protects the Church, that we know that we also must cooperate with His promptings, with the promptings of the Spirit, in order to rightly follow God's will in our lives. And the cardinal electors have to do this too. It surprises some people sometimes that when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, Benedict XVI spoke about the Holy Spirit's role in the conclave. And he said, I would not say that the Holy Spirit picks the Pope. I would say that the Spirit does not exactly take control of the affair, but rather, like a good educator, as it were, leaves us much space and much freedom without entirely abandoning us. And so the Missa Pro Leggendo this morning, the ceremonies at the beginning were meant to help the cardinals to be open to the Spirit in that way, and to put aside other agendas, other political ideologies, and be open to the promptings of grace. And so that's because, and I think that was something very wise of Benedict to say, because in the past, I mean, there's not always been good popes. I mean, in the history of the Church, there have been quite bad popes, and yet the Church endures, and that's the astonishing thing from an historical perspective. And so today we hope, we pray that we are open to the promptings of the Holy Spirit in the conclave and for the cardinal electors.
I think it's particularly interesting that Mass is not just for the cardinals, but of course it's a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, open to the public and to a lot of other people who want to come along and want to be part of that moment at the beginning. As you say, it's marking the beginning of the conclave, and to be actually part of that and to be able to pray together with the cardinal electors for the new Pope is an incredibly moving moment. And again, I noticed this morning there were a number of the ecumenical representatives here in Rome. We have a new Anglican bishop, Bishop Anthony, who is the new head of the Anglican Centre. We have the head of the Methodist Ecumenical Office, the Reformed churches, and they were there together with representatives from the Council, the Dicastery for Christian Unity, again praying together and gathered together with the cardinal electors, praying for a successful outcome to this conclave under the guidance, as you say, of the Holy Spirit.
And that homily by Cardinal Re brings us back to the whole concept of unity as well, because he also reminded those present about the duty to maintain the unity of the Church on the path traced out by Christ. And he explained that unity is marked by profound communion in diversity, provided that full fidelity to the gospel is maintained. Unity in a fractured world is even more poignant. We're living in a time in which the world is so divided. Just last night we learnt of yet another conflict, and I'm referring to the clashes that erupted between India and Pakistan, as every day we remember Gaza, we remember Ukraine, we remember Myanmar, we remember South Sudan, we remember Sudan. Unfortunately, the list is very, very long. So we really do need a moral compass back in this world.
I thought it was interesting during the lead-up to this conclave to see the cardinals actually issuing a statement just ahead of their gathering here in the Sistine Chapel, issuing a statement calling for peace, calling for an end to conflicts, and mentioning particularly Ukraine and Gaza, but as you say, by implication, the many other conflicts that are going on around the world. Of course, peace peace and an end to conflict was such a key theme for Pope Francis, and I thought it was particularly significant that the Cardinals felt it necessary to show that they were absolutely following in this direction, and therefore that these, if you like, considerations that go way beyond those of the Catholic Church and of the Christian world, but the need for dialogue, the need for mediation, the need for peacemakers in our world is particularly on their minds at the moment. And it'll be interesting to see, of course, we know that there have been, that there are cardinals representing countries. I think it's more than 70 countries across the world, is that right?
70, around 70 countries, yes, more than 70.
And therefore, obviously, these political considerations are of extreme importance alongside all the other church business, of course, that they will have been discussing.
And that communique that you mentioned, Philip, was issued yesterday. We, the Cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, meeting in General Congregation before the beginning of the Conclave. That's the meetings that they hold in anticipation of the election. We, the Cardinals, noting with regret that there's been no progress in advancing the peace process in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in so many other parts of the world. And on the contrary, attacks have intensified, especially against civilian populations. We Cardinals make a heartfelt appeal to all parties involved to reach a permanent ceasefire as soon as possible and to negotiate without preconditions, without further delay, the peace long desired by the peoples involved and by the entire world. And that's been a constant, that was certainly a constant theme in Pope Francis' pontificate. Linda, just a moment ago when you were talking about all of those trouble spots throughout the world, all those places of conflict, it sounded just like our former Holy Father, where at his audience he'd constantly go through a litany almost of places that needed our prayers, where we needed peace. And the Cardinals conclude their appeal. We invite all the faithful to intensify their supplication to the Lord for a just and lasting peace. Linda, I know you follow closely the Pope's appeals for peace over the years, not just Pope Francis, but also before that.
Yes, as you were speaking, my mind immediately went to an interview that our colleague in the Africa English section did immediately after the death of Pope Francis. He interviewed the Bishop of Juba in South Sudan, who said, "We have lost the only advocate we have on this world scenario. We have lost the only voice who brings our suffering to the international community whenever he can." You know, it's a huge, huge void. Who is going to speak for us?
One of the historical titles is Pontifex Maximus, right? The Pope is meant to be the chief bridge builder, and the papacy has a unique spot on the world stage to be able to do that with its diplomatic corps, with its experience in this area. And I think back, Francis stands in a long line of popes who have been dedicated single-mindedly to peace. I think Benedict, one of the reasons Benedict chose that the name was Benedict XV, the great Pope of Peace in World War I. And I think of all of the appeals that Pius XII made during the devastation of World War II. And so the papacy is a beacon and needs to continue to be a beacon for these peacemaking movements in the world.
Coming back to South Sudan again, yes, popes have traditionally been peacemakers, people appealing for peace, but I think one of Francis's great strengths, of course, was his gestures, his ability to speak through gestures. And thinking of South Sudan, another thing that really comes to mind was the time that he met with the South Sudanese leaders, the president and the vice president, who were at loggerheads with each other. The conflict had been dragging on. He invited them to the Vatican for that session with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moderator of the Church of Scotland. And I'm sure you've all seen the pictures where he gets down on his knees with great difficulty, and he gets down on his knees to kiss the shoes of these leaders in an extraordinary symbolic gesture of humility, to say to these leaders, these military leaders, stop the fighting. You've been elected to serve your people. And these are the gestures that I think sadly hasn't seemed to have been able to put an end to the war in that country, but very, very poignant and powerful gestures which will remain with us.
And let's remember all the times the popes have gone to the United Nations. We'll never forget Jamais plus la guerre, Pope Paul VI, and then Pope John Paul II. and Pope Francis, they have all been to that incredible forum of nations, that family of nations, to say, stop fighting, listen to the voice of the people. And as Pope Francis very famously wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si, heed the cry of the earth, heed the cry of the poor. It's an incredibly important role.
And I think you mentioned Pope Paul's very heartfelt. You could see it on his face when he cried out, "Never again war, never again war." And I think every subsequent pope that's visited the United Nations has quoted him there. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but Dawn, you mentioned the unique place of the Catholic Church. The Church is present in just about every country in the world, so they have a stake in a lot of these conflicts. Some places the Church is very small. Mongolia has a community of a few thousand people.
1,500
Catholics.
With the Cardinal, though. Right?
But
With the Cardinal, who we saw today.
Is
Cardinal
present
Marengo.
throughout the world. It does have the diplomatic corps, and I know you've done some studies to the diplomatic corps. It's not just the Pope's gestures, which are very, very important. You mentioned the beautiful gesture of the Pope kneeling at the feet of the leaders, but there's also so much work that goes on in the background, which is animated and inspired by the Pope. That's where the Secretary of State, the nuncios, are really trying to carry out the background work of trying to make the Pope's appeals a concrete reality.
One of the surprising things, people come to Rome, they find out it's a city with two sets of embassies, that there's embassies to the Republic of Italy and there's embassies to the Holy See. And the Holy See has diplomatic relations with an immense number of countries, including countries that are at utter loggerheads with one another. And so that in situations of war, in situations of conflict, nations can come to the Vatican and use the diplomatic service in order to exchange messages of peace, in order to exchange messages offering ceasefire. And so it's very important to remember the work of nuncios, of the special envoys, when the Pope sent Cardinal Zuppi to Ukraine as a special envoy for peace, that this is something the Catholic Church is very good at and can be a force for helping to establish lasting peace in these troubled areas.
And as you said, Don, that's something that the Church can do where you can speak with both parties as, if not exactly a neutral party, but at least something that's a little taking a step back, where you can't talk to one another, but you can talk to someone else. We saw that with the Second World War and some of the tremendous work of the Department of State. We also have seen with the Secretary of State, one of the big issues is the plight of displaced persons, and that was a big work of Vatican Radio in its early history. Linda Philippa, maybe you could speak about that role of the Holy See in the humanitarian work of the role of Vatican Radio in the humanitarian work of the Holy See.
Well, I think you're probably referring to the Second World War, right?
Especially, yes.
When the radio started a service announcing the names of prisoners of war, in order that people could tune in and hear whether their husbands, their fathers, their brothers were in these prisoner of war camps following the Second World War. And that was, as I say, way back after the Second World War. But of course, if you're talking about the plight of displaced people, then much more recently during this past decade, of course, we think of how significant an issue, I would say a top priority this was for Pope Francis. Hard to forget that the first place he chose to visit after his election was the tiny island of Lampedusa down to the south of Italy here. Why? Because he wanted to remember all the people, all the many, many, many people who have lost their lives trying to flee their countries, trying to get to safety and security for their families, and losing their lives in the Mediterranean in these terrible flimsy boats that just capsize. And so these kind of, again, the image of him throwing that those flowers into the wreaths of flowers into the sea from the boat to remember the people who'd lost their lives there, and then speaking with other migrants who had successfully arrived in Lampedusa on that first visit. It was a theme that he started out that way, and he continued to do that all the way through his pontificate, to remember migrants and refugees and people seeking peace, seeking safety, seeking decent standards of living. It really was a top priority for him, I think.
And he did that in the company of the ecumenical patriarch, if I'm not mistaken. I think Bartholomew was on that boat with him.
Bartholomew went to the refugee camp in Lesbos.
Right,
I think you're thinking of the time he visited there when he went on a trip to Greece, and he traveled there with, yes, Patriarch Bartholomew, for whom also this is a priority. And it was, again, a moving occasion to talk to many of these men, women and children who had risked everything to cross the sea to try and get to safety. And yeah, meeting with refugees in the camp there was another very significant moment. But also here in the Vatican, you remember he invited families, he had families come over here with the help of the St. Egidio community.
The Humanitarian Corridors.
The Humanitarian Corridors program. There was an awful lot of work went on together with the Dicastery for Integral Human Development and the Refugee Department there, and all the work that's been done, particularly during this past decade, I would say, is extremely significant.
Meanwhile, I'm seeing here on the chat that's adjourning us is that the people in the square are clapping their hands in an attempt to get the Cardinals to hurry up with the voting process.
We're going to have an Urban the Sixth situation.
They've been in there for a couple of hours now, haven't they?
They have been, yeah, they've been waiting out there.
Maybe we can take a short musical break.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, we welcome you to Vatican Radio's live coverage of the Conclave to elect the 266th successor of St. Peter. 267th Pope, 266th successor, I think is last count. But that's actually an interesting point because the official list of popes has changed numerous times over the years, and in fact there was a change in the 20th century with different popes who had traditionally been counted as popes suddenly struck from the list, and perhaps some other clarifications from historical scholars.
Well, so you have things like Benedict IX, who was pope 3 different times, and then John the 20th that didn't quite make the list eventually, and so they had to skip one. And so the list of popes does, when historians look at these things and they get more details and they get more ideas, the church will decide whether or not that this person was a legitimate Roman pontiff or not. Because this is an important question. This is a Catholic fact. We have to know who is the pope. We have to know because Christ promised this to his church, and so it's critical that we know who and what are. But so sometimes in the dim recesses of history where we have too few records, it's difficult to say for sure.
I'm not a historian myself, but of course the medallions in the great Basilica of St. Mary Major that contain the images.
Now that's St. Paul's Basilica outside the walls.
Yeah.
St. Paul's outside the walls, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
But presumably the number up on the wall there is what we consider to be the official tally, is that right?
Not quite, in fact, because at least a few anti-popes are up in medallions, including my personal favorite, at one time considered a pope, now considered an anti-pope, Pope Christopher, the one and only. He's one of them that they struck from the list due to the rather odd circumstances,
untoward circumstances regarding an election
of his accession. Meanwhile, if you are just joining us, we are entering the third hour of our coverage of the conclave. We are anxiously awaiting smoke to appear from the chimney in above the Sistine Chapel. That's still not happening. As we heard just a little while ago, the crowds that have now gathered in St. Peter's Square are getting a little enthusiastic in their expectation of the Pope. As we do enter our third hour, I would like once again to thank our television and radio partners, including EWTN TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television Network USA, Atma Darshan TV, Catholic TV, Mada TV India, and Uganda Catholic Television, UCTV, as well as radio partners Luminous Radio and Radio Katipunan in the Philippines. I'm here with Linda Bordoni, our very learned guests, Philippa Hitchin and Don Prudlow. And perhaps we could talk a little bit about what we can expect. Some of us have been listening to our broadcast now for a couple of hours and maybe wondering what's happening and what's going on right at the moment.
Well, I think they're getting ready to burn the ballots. Meantime, another thing we've all been chatting about in the run-up is what name will the new pontiff choose? Because it's a long-standing tradition that the name, the baptismal name, is changed, but it hasn't always been so, if I'm not mistaken. But we do know that the first act of the new Pope, immediately after accepting his canonical election as the Supreme Pontiff and before fulfilling other obligations, is the choice of his name. And this name is announced famously on the loggia by the Cardinal Protodeacon after the famous formula Habemus Papam, followed by the Pope's baptismal name in Latin. So Francis was the first Francis. I remember we were going, we're going to call him Francis the First, and we were told, no, it's just Francis, he is the first. But it's an old custom that apparently emerged as early as the first millennium of Christianity, and I'm reading here, Professor, because
it's 1,500 years old, so it is a pretty well-established custom.
And can you tell us anything about the popularity of certain names, why they became so much more popular than others, why Francis perhaps was never chosen until this last pontificate?
Well, there have been a series of quite traditional names. I mean, there's a good list with 266 popes to choose from. There's good, and it ties people back into continuity with the past. Benedict, naming himself after Saint Benedict, and after Pope Benedict XV, the Pope of Peace. I tend to think Pope Benedict XIV, the great scholar pope as well, that he tied himself to. But and then you had the innovation of John Paul, right, having the two papal names. And he will be, if there ever is another Francis, he will have to be Francis I. I mean, he doesn't have any choice.
He will be Francis I.
He will have to be Francis. If there's a Francis II, there's going to have to be. Yeah, he'd have to be retroactively promoted to Francis I. But this is a great moment, because it's the first time that we can get an insight into the mind of the new pope when they have this name. So, for instance, if, as a lot of people think, the new pope may choose the name Leo, we know that that's probably in line with Leo's great work with social justice, with Catholic social teaching, but also, hopefully, Leo's great work with Catholic academics as well.
But how many Leos have there been?
Well, he would be Leo the 14th. So there would be Leo the 14th. But John, you'd have John would be a popular one, Paul would be a popular one, or John Paul III even. But all those will have nuances, right? They'll all have meanings that the Pope will be able to tell us, and we won't be able to exhaust them. I mean, they're suggestive, right? We'll see. Well, that's an interesting name.
And the commentators will be out in force to explain exactly why the Pope chose that particular name. We've seen there's certainly a tradition of choosing names from immediate or close predecessors.
There has been, and Benedict sort of broke that, and that was interesting. And I think that's because we had John Paul and then John Paul. I think that was good to break off from that a little bit. But you're right, they go up and down in popularity. I doubt that we'll get a Sixtus VI. I think that we may have ended that line. That probably won't make it.
We haven't had many Pauls.
We haven't had many Pauls, right? There's been a lot more Johns than Pauls. But that's definitely a possibility. That's not. But then you have these strange names from early in papal history, right? Like Conon or Lando, and those are likely going to continue to stay in abeyance. But a name like Innocent or Clement, right? These were immensely popular in the 17th and 18th century, and they tied them back to those great histories with those names too. I mean, John's was kind of a surprise, because there had not been very many creditable Johns in papal history, and so it was kind of a surprise, particularly. And there was controversy even about his numbering, because one of the anti-popes of Avignon was John the 23rd. There's actually an anti-pope, John the 23rd, buried in Florence, so that was confusing as well. But he wanted to make his personal statement with that.
And as you say, some names gain popularity because of wildly popular popes, but some names fall off when you've had a pope who really did have, as you said, a discreditable reputation, and suddenly we see a lot fewer. One of perhaps the most famous bad popes, Alexander VI, and we did have a successor, but afterwards the name just kind of fell into disuse for now since several hundred years.
Right, that's right. But this, I mean, there was some very good Alexanders in history as well as some not so good Alexanders. But and popes don't always choose a name based on Christian principles. So Pius II, he was Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, and he was so enamored of the Aeneid that he wanted to be Pius Aeneas. So he was Pius II, not because of any devotion to St. Pius.
Julius because II, of devotion to Virgil.
To Virgil. Well, it's much like Dante, right? Our beloved Dante. And Julius II wanted to be named after Julius Caesar, I think. So that's worked. But there were both Piuses after Pius II and Juliuses after Julius II. So
having had so many Italian popes, of course, throughout history, all selecting from perhaps what you're talking about, some of the traditional names, I'm wondering what a difference it might make having cardinals from these 70 different countries, and if perhaps we should have a pope from Africa or Asia or again Latin America, wondering what difference that might make in the selection of a name.
That would be interesting, because we have had Greek popes and Syriac popes and African popes. The great Pope Gelasius was North African. and Pope Zephyrinus was Syrian. There was a period in the 8th century where we had almost all Greek and Syrian popes. And so looking back to that history would be instructive as well. I mean, to the persecuted Christians of the Middle East or of North Africa, it could point to that and still be rooted in the Church's history as well.
You certainly need a historian on hand, don't you, to help you make this selection? I can see that you're never going to be out of a job.
They've never let historians into the conclave, though. There's no on-call historian, so maybe.
And how important is it that a pope be proficient in Latin?
Well, I think it's critical as the patriarch of the West and as the head of the Latin Rite of the Catholic Church. I mean, it's pretty critical. And you saw, I mean, when you have these big international events, you notice that the entire thing was conducted in Latin for these cardinals, and it helps in a certain sense to decenter any particular ethnicity or linguistic group that provides something of that common unity that when the liturgy used to be in one language, that did provide that commonality throughout the world, but still today provides it at these really critical moments, so that when all Christians come together in Rome to celebrate Mass with the Pope, that they can sing the Pater Noster in one language, and so I think that's a wonderful thing. So it's pretty critical that he knows. The new Pope will have to know Italian too, since Italian has become the lingua franca of the Holy See.
It was very interesting during the broadcast prior to this one when we watched the Cardinals going into conclave, and there was a long moment where each of the Cardinals swore to uphold the oath. The full oath was read by Cardinal Parolin, and then each successive cardinal said, "I personally swear to abide by this with my hands on the Gospels." But all of them made that oath in Latin. And if you were watching on the video, you saw they had a cheat sheet in front of them with the precise phrase. What was really fascinating, you saw Latin cardinals, but you also saw cardinals from Eastern churches from all over the world, and each of them was pronouncing the exact same words in Latin in their own language. And I thought that was one of the most moving parts of the ceremony, where you'd hear an American perhaps with a bit of an Irish accent, and you'd hear a Japanese cardinal or an African cardinal, or cardinals from all over the world.
Mm-hmm. I heard Stephen Brislin with his South African accent.
For those of you, I mean, we all remember Pope Benedict pronouncing his Latin with a very strong German accent, which I found very endearing. So it really does offer a kind of point of unity where it's not a living language that's going to be privileged, but it's a language that everybody can kind of have a share in.
And yet the language question, of course, is quite an issue for cardinals coming from so many different countries, perhaps in places where they haven't had an education in Latin to the same degree as would happen here, for example, in the universities, the pontifical universities in Rome. Even in the general congregations and so on and so forth, what is the general rule for the language that is spoken? You mentioned the need to speak Italian, of course, if you are elected Pope, because that is the language as the Bishop of Rome. You're expected to have a good command of Italian, but that isn't necessarily the case for a lot of these men, is it?
Several popes have reiterated the importance of learning Latin, and so, because I mean that's the language of canon law and of all official documents in the Catholic Church. It's really critical that we help to form young priests, especially in emerging countries. But then we also expect them, like you said, we expect them to learn Italian too, and so this is also extremely difficult for particularly non-Mediterranean, non-Western people, and so a privileging of Latin would sort of decenter Italian in that way a little bit. You would still have to learn Italian, but you'd have this more focused on the universal language.
And that's been an interesting question. Up until not very long ago, most of the cardinals would have had some common language, maybe not knowing Latin very well, but having a little bit so that they could at least talk to one another. And we already saw in the general congregations before that in the various synods, the synods of synodality, where you have to come up with a language that people can understand, or make sure that different addresses, documents are translated into various languages. For a long time, the cardinals would have been largely well educated, and or when I say well, not good, but in the sense of had a lot of education and maybe could talk to one another. One of the things they've talked about with this conclave, with 133 different cardinals, not all of them speak Italian, not all of them speak English or Spanish, which are somewhat common languages, but they're in a room where if they want to talk to one another, there are some limitations as to their ability to communicate. And that
and we see it with synodality too, right? We often get shunted off into language groups, right? Which is sort of defeating the purpose of the whole idea. I mean, just it's difficult for us to conceive of, say, but Vatican II, to think back to Vatican II, and that the entire thing for 4 years was conducted in Latin, with everyone having an equal voice and able to discuss with one another in that. Now, it's possible that new translation software and things can come and make a difference like this, but having that common tongue has been something that's been very important to the Western world.
That would be an interesting technological change if in some future conclave they're all issued a universal communicator to translate on the spot, and then you don't have to worry about translators coming in and violating.
And I think about that ecumenically too, because I mean the use of Latin transcended the boundaries of the Catholic Church for so many centuries. In Europe, it was the common diplomatic language. It was the language. There's a famous exchange between C.S. Lewis and an Italian priest. Neither of them spoke the other's language, so they wrote each other letters in Latin. And so that is one of those commonalities too that we all share.
Yeah. And we're still waiting for the
seagulls. Even
the seagull has given up.
Yeah.
I'm hearing it's getting chilly out there as well.
And one of the things that we can expect is that at least some of the cardinals probably have in mind what effect this is having on people outside.
I would think, yes.
Could be a good sign because, or it could be just that they're waiting to burn the ballots. Who knows?
But they should, because it's just one ballot, that they wouldn't have to wait after the scrutiny is done.
But as you were saying earlier, I think, Chris, this is going to affect timings, isn't it? I'm imagining not just today, but we start again tomorrow morning. Just give us a recap of the times that are expected. The Cardinals gather again at 9 o'clock in the morning, is that right? Inside the Sistine Chapel.
They begin with Mass and prayer. The actual voting is largely, as we've said, it's not a point. The conclave is not a place where people are going to get up and give campaign speeches or much speeches at all. I've heard many cardinals talk about conclaves as more like a retreat than anything else. And when they come into the Sistine Chapel and do the vote, that's all they do. So what we've been kind of expecting, it's very imprecise, as we're seeing even as we speak. We're kind of expecting the first votes to take place and maybe be finished up by 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning. If there's a positive outcome, we would see the white smoke then. If not, they'll proceed immediately to a second vote, which is then going to take another hour or an hour and a half. And at the conclusion of that vote, they will burn ballots from both of the previous scrutinies. So then we could see either black or white smoke. The kind of general feeling and general ideas that might happen around 1 o'clock each day.
Yeah, and let's remember that this service that we are providing is not just in English, of course. Being Vatican Radio, it's in 7 languages, the live service that we are doing now. But the other languages will also be broadcasting, so it's going out in a lot of languages as we speak. And of course, everything is on our website, on our social media, on Twitter.
And not just spoken languages.
And not just spoken languages, the sign languages, in various sign languages. There's the Italian sign language, the American sign language. And I'm hearing here that we have Devon on the line. He's still in the square. Devon, hello. Hi, good. Is it getting dark? We're all wondering what's going to happen. We've entered the two and a half hours since the beginning of this commentary. And so, yes, the seagull appears to have also left its position next to the chimney.
Perhaps also growing impatient.
Have you spoken to any other pilgrims or Romans in the square who have specially come for the occasion? Absolutely. We will. Thank you very much, Devin.
And what's very interesting is that if they've chosen not to do a vote this evening, or if there's a problem, that's probably not the level of intervention that will cause them to break the conclave. So there's no real means for them to let us know what's happening inside. So we're gonna keep guessing and keep waiting and praying. For those of you who are listening in, we can tell you a little bit about how you can listen in to and follow the papal election on Vatican media. As we mentioned, we followed the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff earlier this morning. You can learn some more about that on our website. If you're watching on TV, you see our famous seagull has returned, at least one of them. There are various languages that you can follow the events in, including sign languages, American Sign Language, and some of the Spanish and Italian versions. Vatican Media is also providing video and photo coverage of the various events that took place today, the Mass and the entry into the Conclave. And we will be opening up a live broadcast for each of the periods when we do expect a papal vote continuing tomorrow morning, beginning at, I believe, 10 a.m.
I think the broadcast goes live at 10:30 a.m.
10:30 a.m. And you can go to our Vatican website to find all of the broadcast times. And we do really hope you will join us. We do invite you as well to visit our social media pages, including Facebook, X, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can follow along and see everything that's happening, or in this case, not happening this evening, as we wait for the sign that a scrutiny has taken place.
You're talking about social media, you're talking about the radio broadcasts. Of course, the Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper, is also waiting anxiously for the results of this papal election. If I remember rightly, they produce a special edition,
remember rightly.
Yeah, yes. And almost as soon as the announcement is made on the balcony, the presses start rolling, or at least the copy editors start putting out this edition so that it can be distributed free, I think, in St. Peter's Square to people as soon after the event.
As was the one that marked the passing of Pope Francis. Meanwhile, they tell me we have someone else in the square. It's Sister Nina Krafich. She works here at the Dicastery for Communications. She is a communications expert. Nina, hello. It's your first conclave, isn't it, Nina? You are an expert in communications, but not only in social media communications. How do you think Generation X, the millennials, are following this conclave? How do you think? I was speaking about social media, which is very much your field, and getting the message out to the younger generations. How are they following this conclave? What kind of interest have you been perceiving from them? You are very young yourself, Nina. Well, you know how we knew that you were there, Nina? Leo, my son Leo, saw you on Instagram in the square. Right. A chimney and a seagull, yes. Thank you, Nina. Yes. We'll be speaking to you again. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. So that was Nina Kravish. She knows all about influencers and the dicastery that has understood very profoundly that it has to move with the times if it wants to keep up with the world, and has brought her in to study the role of influencers in communication and to talk to gatherings. She goes to speak at conferences about the church and communications with a very new voice.
You need a dicastery of influencing.
Interesting, though, that what we think of as the generation that likes everything instantly, that people should be standing there for an hour and a half, 2.5 hours now, watching a chimney without anything happening at all. So quite a turnout for the books, and interesting to see the reaction. Will people not be so interested over the coming days, or will that simply increase the tension and increase the interest? We'll have to see tomorrow what happens.
Francesca's telling me the numbers have gone up. There are 45,000 people in the square at 20:35. That's 25 to 9 local time here in Rome.
Well, it's still mercifully before Italian dinner time, but it's well past American dinner time.
You were giving us the timeline, Chris, earlier on. Tomorrow in the morning, as you say, the Cardinals go in. They have 2 votes in the morning. Then they break for lunch, don't they?
They do have a break in the afternoon. They will, after the second vote, if the first vote is not conclusive, they'll go immediately to the second vote. Then they do have some time. They'll have their lunch. There'll be more prayers. Of course, each session of the voting in the Sistine Chapel is marked by prayer, especially to the Holy Spirit. We can take a look at some of the prayers that we saw today for the opening of the conclave. And then the expectation is, Don was just talking about Roman meal times, but time for a long lunch or a nap, and then they'll be back in the Sistine Chapel.
Always in the seclusion of Santa Marta.
Always in the seclusion of Santa Marta. I was struck, we've mentioned a couple of times, the movie The Conclave, and we've all seen various parts of the Conclave, and I noticed a lot of the sets bear zero resemblance whatsoever to the places they're purporting to be. But going back to the schedule, we will have, or expect to have, a vote in the afternoon. That's what's provided for in Universi Dominici Gregis. We'll begin coverage around 4 in the afternoon Rome time. And if there is a successful vote, we'll see the white smoke. Otherwise, we'll have to wait for a few more hours, and possibly the first smoke we might see in the afternoon in coming days might be around 5:30 or 6. Later, if it does go to a second ballot, we will see smoke of some sort, hopefully, around 7 or 7:30 is the expectation. But as we talked about, there was...
I'm getting news about that. Apparently the last time there was not a vote, so there was no smoke during the session, was in 1941. But they're also pointing
there
out...
wouldn't have been, right? Because there wasn't a conclave that year.
Ooh, wow.
So that was to be expected.
So that was not a good information I get here. Because they also point out there were far fewer cardinals in that conclave, but as you say, no conclave in 1941.
Maybe they meant 1939.
We'll have to check that. Check on that again.
And still nothing. It still looks quite light out there.
And of course, the cameras are pointing out towards the west, so the last shreds of daylight will be seen from the perspective that we're looking at the chimney. Whereas for those in the square, if they turn around and look out to the east, they'll see that the light is dying out. We can see out the window here, skies growing pretty dark in the other direction, and we might have a situation where it does become difficult to see the smoke or tell what color it is.
In which case we would be waiting for the bells again, as we were mentioning earlier, if it's a successful vote. Otherwise, people will be craning their necks to see what they can see from the square. But
meanwhile, it might be a good opportunity to talk about one of the unique features of this conclave. For, as we've mentioned earlier, there are 133 cardinals who entered into the conclave. That's the largest number of cardinals ever. And there was actually a little bit of a discrepancy in the law and the procedures governing the conclave, because Paul VI in 1975 had introduced a rule that the maximum number of cardinal electors would not be more than 120. Don, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the history of the numbers of electors. Maybe even going back a little further, the question of who would be made an elector was a very contentious issue, and when popes would make new cardinals to influence perhaps the conclaves, this was a big point of contention with the college at times.
Yes, absolutely. So the origins of as you know, there are 3 levels of cardinals. There's cardinal bishops, there's cardinal priests, and cardinal deacons. And originally, there are 6 cardinal bishops of the Suburbicarian sees. He's like Frascati and Ostia. Ostia is the senior bishop on the see. There were 35 cardinal priests. Cardinal priests were drawn from the original tituli, the early parishes of the city of Rome. And so we can see before even the year 500 the lists of the original parishes, and they would be given the title to these parishes. And there were 14 cardinal deacons. The city was divided into 14 different districts based on the needs of the faithful. And so as time went on, this number was fixed at 70. But during the early modern period, the church had grown so much and worldwide that 70 wasn't enough to give a decent representation for the church anymore. And so during the after Vatican II, the number was increased to 120, and this allowed for a much wider representation of cardinals from throughout the world. And the discrepancy came because because popes wanted to make more appointments, because you have cardinals aging out all the time. They're always, every month or two you have another cardinal that doesn't get to vote anymore. And it's not just Francis that exceeded the number. Benedict and John Paul also exceeded the number. They just did not have a conclave during the period when the number was exceeded. And so clearly it's the manifest will of the supreme legislator, the three last popes, that if there were to be a conclave, it would be that all the eligible electors. So the cardinals a couple days ago made a decision saying that this was the manifest will of the elector. All cardinals under 80 who are in Rome and can participate can vote.
Joining us now in studio, we have Joseph Tulloch, our very own Joseph Tulloch from the English section. We were mentioning the Mass this morning. Joseph was actually one of the readers at that Mass, as he read the other day at after the funeral Mass in suffrage for Pope Francis. Joe, you were standing out there in that square filled with tens of thousands of people. First of all, would you like to tell us what that felt like and how you lived this experience?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe. I'm part of the English team here at Vatican News. And what Linda's talking about there is... So I was reading this morning, but before that I had the chance to read at the second, what they call Novem Diales Mass, so the second Mass, basically, in memory of Pope Francis. It was really nice. It was a really great opportunity to say goodbye to the Pope. That was right after the death, and we were still really, really missing him. So that was a really great opportunity. There's about 200,000 people showed up for that Mass. I think some of them had been planning to come. There was supposed to be the canonization of Carlo Acutis on that day, and so there was lots of young people who were already going to be in Rome. But what was nice was they were clearly happy to be there for the Mass that they had to go to instead, which was the second memorial Mass for the Pope. There's lots of cheering. They really... there was really... Sorry, I thought I saw a flash of smoke there, but it was just a seagull's wing, I think.
Right.
Very disappointing. So that was a really great opportunity. And then this morning, too, that was the Missa Pro Eligendo, so the Mass for the election of the Pope, and it's basically this opportunity for the cardinals to come together, and together with the people of God, lots of ordinary Catholics and perhaps some non-Catholics gathered in the Basilica with them to pray and to invoke the Holy Spirit on this conclave process. So really nice. I did, to be honest, when I've been here now at Vatican News for about 2.5 years, and I always imagined that the conclave would be this period where I'd be doing so much journalism and going around and reporting on everything, and in the end I've just read a lot of Masses. But that's nice as well, and I've really...
You've been working hard as well, writing
that's true as well.
And what reading did you do this morning?
So it was a reading, putting me on the spot, it was from, I think, the prophet Isaiah, and really nice reading about, I think it's the one that has, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has appointed me to preach the good word to the poor, something like that. So the kind of a reading coming out of this prophetic tradition in the Old Testament, and of course the readings are picked, I assume, with kind of the idea of reminding the cardinals of what they're looking for in a pope. So somebody who will have the poor in mind. I think I'm getting the reading right. It's funny actually, when you're there reading, you're so focused on saying the words right that you're not even thinking about what it means. So I may have misremembered what the reading was.
No, I think you're remembering rightly.
Yeah.
That it was focused on the characteristics that a new pope should hopefully have. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Joe is going to be in studio with us again in these coming days as we await the smoke, unless at this point it could be white.
Who knows? Yeah,
who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to be joining on Friday morning. If, of course, we could very well have a new pope by then, because by then there will have been there'll be 9 ballots between now and Friday morning. So there's 1 ballot this evening, and then there'll be 4 tomorrow. And so it's quite possible to have a new pope by Friday morning, but if not, you'll be able to listen to me and my wonderful colleague Francesca Merlo, who's producing today, but she'll be joining me in the studio on Friday morning. If we don't have a pope by then, who knows?
Yes, thank you here to Francesca Merlo and to Mario Scarton, who are both working on the other side of the window here in this Vatican Radio studio.
We've been talking a bit about all that's happened between the funeral and the general congregations leading up to to this conclave. Perhaps we could just take a brief look at actually what happens. We've talked about the Pope coming out onto the balcony, the first acclamation by the people of Rome, and so on. But then we have to look forward also to the installation, the inauguration of the new papal ministry. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about what happens then, remembering past occasions. It's usually about a week, isn't it, between the announcement, between the successful outcome of the conclave?
Well, first of all, all the delegations that are going to be here in Rome for that ceremony have to get here. So it can't be immediately afterwards. There are some technical times that have to be respected. So even should the Pope be elected on Friday, it couldn't be on Sunday. It would just be too early. Although on Sunday he could probably do his first Angelus address.
Yes, absolutely. And we have to remember that if he's a bishop already, and all the cardinals in there, and most of the cardinals are bishops, that he becomes Pope the moment he accepts. When the cardinal asks him, do you accept the canonical election as Roman Pontiff? And he says, yes, he's the Pope. And so the installation Mass is, it's not a formality, it's a very important moment that he inaugurates his Petrine ministry. But he becomes Pope with full authority at that moment. And then the inauguration, I remember being at the inauguration in 2013 and being up on the colonnade. That was a great privilege. I love doing that. You see, because then you allow people just for the funeral too, like when they have the delay, you want the dignitaries to be able to come, and they will come. I mean, as we've seen it, I mean, the world pays attention to what happens in the city, and that's critical. But there's a whole set of ceremonies that go along with the new Pope, right? That culminate really after the installation Mass with the actual possessio, the taking possession of his cathedral at St. John Lateran, which I was also present for when Pope Francis took charge of his cathedral. And so this is a wonderful series of events that makes fuller the meaning of what's happening in the Sistine Chapel right now.
Pope Francis particularly wanted his inauguration, if I remember correctly, to be on the feast day of St. Joseph. Isn't that right? And that, of course, became, again, a bit of a theme during the pontificate. We learned that he had the statue of the sleeping Joseph that he would keep on his bedside table there in Santa Marta. Had a particular significance for him, didn't it?
And he inserted the name of Joseph in every Mass that was said throughout the world. So this is a great devotion to St. Joseph, to St. Joseph in his feast days, as patron of the Universal Church, but also as a patron of workers and as a patron of Christian fathers. It was very important to him, for sure.
The thing I remember particularly about the installation of Francis, of course, was that it was only 3 days apart from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and because I was covering ecumenical affairs, I wanted to be in both places, and fortunately, because there was that little time gap, it could have been on the same day, but actually, in the end, I was able to be here in Rome for the papal inaugural Mass, the papal installation, and then get to Canterbury as well for the Archbishop of Canterbury's taking the beginning of his ministry there in Canterbury Cathedral. And there was a nice, when Francis died, there was a nice little tribute from Justin Welby, no longer, of course, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but there was a nice tribute in which he talks about his first meeting with Pope Francis, and he was ushered into these, extraordinarily elaborate and baroque surroundings in the Apostolic Palace, and feeling a little bit intimidated anyway, and he sits down, and the Pope begins by saying, I'm senior to you, as you know, and of course his kind of heart sunk, and he thought, well, this kind of wasn't the tone I was expecting, and then the Pope looks up and jokes and goes, by 3 days only. And
we also learned to know him and to walk with him after that 13th of March, which we don't forget because we were here. We didn't know who Bergoglio was, and very slowly we began to understand him. He went to Lampedusa, as you mentioned, his very first journey abroad, after having said that he didn't really want to travel. It wasn't his thing, but he went to Lampedusa because that issue was so important for him. And being there, he realized, he told us afterwards, he realized how important it was for the people to feel his closeness and to feel he was going to them. And he ended up undertaking 48 apostolic journeys abroad, as well as many others within Italy. Joe was on his last apostolic journey abroad to Belgium.
Yeah,
penultimate, because the last one
was
to Corsica.
Exactly.
But you went to Belgium.
That's right. Yeah. So there was a very quick one to Corsica where he came back, and I think within the day, exactly. But before that, the longest kind of traditional papal journey. Sorry, the last traditional papal journey was the one he did to Luxembourg and Belgium. I was with the Pope for the stop he did in Belgium, and it was an interesting papal journey because it came right after this huge one that lasted several weeks across a couple of countries in Asia. So
4 countries.
4 countries in Asia.
Asia and Oceania.
Yeah, and there'd been some, for instance, he'd been in East Timor, where something crazy like 70% or 60% of the population turned up for a mass he celebrated, and these incredible scenes. And I think it's the most Catholic country in the world, with the possible exception of Vatican City.
No, I think it's more Catholic than Vatican City.
Okay.
That's what the Vatican officials quit. But
okay, right. And so he'd just come back from that, and then he came to Belgium, which is obviously a fairly secular country. It's a country that's been really marked by the sexual abuse crisis, which is something that's happened in the church all over the world, but it was particularly bad in Belgium. And so it's a country where there's also, on a level, there's some also distrust, I think you can say, towards the church. And so it was a very interesting papal journey for that reason. The Pope did a couple of things. So he met with survivors of sexual abuse, and that was a closed-door meeting, so there were no journalists there. We don't know exactly what was said, but there were some interviews afterwards with some of the survivors who said that he really listened to them and they felt moved by that. And he also visited some universities. So Belgium is home to 2 famous Catholic universities. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. One is, I think, Leuven, and one is Louvain. And one is Dutch-speaking or Flemish-speaking. The other one is French-speaking. And they're 2 very historic, very prestigious Catholic universities, and the Pope visited both of them. There was, if I remember rightly, there was at Leuven, the Flemish Dutch-speaking one. He kind of had an exchange with the professors, and then what was interesting was afterwards when he came to Louvain, it was more a dialogue with the students. But on both kind of occasions, he was doing what we really came to expect from Pope Francis, which was this dialogue, kind of talking to people, even people who disagreed with him. I remember there was some when the students were talking to him, as well as they agreed with a lot of what he said, and then they were pointing out some points where they disagreed, and that was really typical of Pope Francis as well, this desire to talk to people, even people that didn't agree with him.
Absolutely.
And so it was kind of it was a classic Francis trip in that way.
I was speaking to the international director of the Jesuit Refugee Service just slightly after his death, and he said very much what you have been saying. He would sit down and enter into dialogue with the person he had before him, and it was never a problem to disagree or to listen to a differing perspective. In fact, he was interested in doing exactly that.
Yeah. Certainly the fact of his meeting with Jesuits wherever he travelled in any of the journeys around the world became a particular hallmark, didn't it, of these trips, and I think a particularly important moment for the Jesuit community throughout the world. I'm wondering, Don, if you can tell us anything about the frequencies of popes belonging to particular orders as opposed to those who don't. I mean,
it's not terribly common. We remember it was almost a shock when Jorge Bergoglio was a Jesuit, right? It was kind of popularly thought that a Jesuit would never become pope, so that was very shocking. There have been several popes from religious orders. From the Franciscans and Dominicans, each have a handful of popes. None since the 18th century, late 18th century. There have been some monk popes, particularly during the period of the monastic revival in the 11th century. But by and large, they have been taken, a lot of them, from the secular clergy. That's been mainly, and they've kind of gone back and forth between the diplomatic corps and between canon lawyers and theologians, and that's been pretty much the case. There hasn't been too much of a... While there is always, I would say, about 50% of representation in the College of Cardinals come from religious orders. They do not often get elected to the papacy. I don't think it's any particular animus against... It maybe historically have been against against Jesuits, but that's not. But I'm talking back from the very foundation of the order. But it's really something that the person has to fit the job too. And very often religious orders are focused on a ministry. They're focused on a particular specialty. And the pastor, the secular priest, the bishop has got to be all things to all people. And that often is better training for the kind of things you'll encounter in the papacy than other forms of religious living.
And I'm wondering, is that 15% roughly the same today with the cardinals who are gathered behind the walls of the Sistine Chapel?
I could make a count, but I would suggest it's roughly 15 to 20%.
And so after the Pope died, I saw a couple of headlines saying something along the lines of Pope Francis never stopped being a Jesuit. And this idea that as you were saying there, that each of these orders has their own charism and they really mark the members of those orders. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the ways in which Pope Francis never stopped being a Jesuit, the ways in which his Jesuit formation really shaped him and became the Pope that we all knew.
I think the Jesuit formation creates such strong individuals. They are able to. I mean, think of the great Jesuit missionaries that are able to operate. They're meant from the very foundation not to live in religious community, right? I mean, they're meant to be able to be sort of sole proprietors sometimes when they need to be, and so go off like Francis Xavier around the world by themselves, never see another Jesuit for years and years and years. And I think that kind of style, that kind of particularly the Jesuit emphasis on obedience and on sort of the voluntas of the superior was very much in evidence in ways that you might not see from a Dominican perspective as well. So I think that strongly individualistic way of doing things. I don't mean individualism in a bad sense. I mean a strong, well-formed person that is able to act and knows their mind and acts in that way. And Jesuit formation is really effective at creating that. And so I think we saw some of those aspects coming out in his papacy for sure.
Would you say also the question of discernment, which is a particular feature of the spiritual exercises of the Jesuit mindset in some ways, and of course the discernment process is perhaps at the basis of this synodality, the synods on synodality and so on that Pope Francis has begun and as we know has set in place, set in motion through to another synod in 2028. I think that would perhaps also be another feature of
I think
of
so.
the
That's
Jesuits.
exactly right.
Yeah.
I'd like to remember Pope Francis's last gift, which was a Pope-mobile that has been readapted, thank you, Philippa, into a health clinic for the people of Gaza. I think that is such a significant and powerful gesture, reminding the world of those most in need.
And it came, of course, following the phone calls that he traditionally made so regularly to the parish, the Holy Family Parish in Gaza, which I think you visited. I was able to do so when I went there to the Holy Land some years ago, and was able to go to Gaza with the previous parish priest, and you know how significant it is, how important it is in any situation of conflict like that to know that the world has not forgotten you, to know that people are praying for you, that people are praying for peace. And clearly those phone calls that Pope Francis insisted on making right up until the previous weekend.
From the hospital, when he was in the hospital, when he could, he would call Padre Romanelli and just ask them what they'd had for dinner.
There's no smoke.
We do have smoke coming out of that chimney, but it's definitely black.
It's definitely black smoke. It's 21 hours. It's 9 o'clock in the evening here in Rome. And that is,
They took their time with it.
They took their time. They had a good think. They listened to a meditation by the papal preacher, which probably took time as well. Definitely black smoke there, I would say.
And I wonder what the reaction is in the square below, to the crowds who are seeing that and knowing that there has been no decision, no successful outcome on this occasion. And now we have a shot of the square. I can see some cell phones flashing away there. Whether they'll be able to capture black smoke billowing in the wind there out of the chimney and away across the rooftop of the Sistine Chapel and the rest of the Vatican museums. I'm not sure, but that's certainly black smoke.
I wonder
sure.
if we have some sound from the square there. Do we have squares? No, we don't. They tell us we don't. But we can see. Here we are.
Well,
The noise
they've
of
made
the
sure
crowd.
of it at least. That's good. They've
Oh,
got
wow.
a good bit of it. Yes, a good crowd in the square.
And you can see, of course, those giant screens set up so
Right.
that even if you can't actually see from where you're standing,
Which it looks
Yeah.
difficult to see from
It
now.
does.
it does,
It
doesn't
does.
it? Yeah. And in fact, I remember that from past
And as you were
years.
saying, it's
At
dark.
nighttime, yes,
Yes.
it becomes difficult.
Mhm. Okay.
Well, that is again. I never fail to be moved by the sight of our most beautiful city, the Bernini Colonnade, St. Peter's illuminated, that night sky. It could have rained today, but it didn't, which is also
It
a
looks
blessing
like we
for
may
many.
have good weather for the rest of the week. So
There you are.
And you can see if you're watching on the television screen, it is now completely dark in Rome. The lights are on, the new illumination of the dome of St. Peter's. And the crowd, I think, is very relieved to see smoke, and very definite black smoke. I think there is no question from the very beginning.
But I want to say thanks to Joseph Tulloch for joining us there. He disappeared out of the
Yes,
studio.
and thanks again to Joseph
And-
for relaying his experiences. And thanks to our team in studio.
I can see people making their way
Yes, people
fairly
are moving.
swiftly out of the square.
Towards
Definitely past dinner time here in Rome. But
And I'll
people
tell you,
will
it's going to be tough to find a restaurant anywhere near St. Peter's this evening.
yes.
But do keep following us here on Vatican Media, Vatican News.
We'll start tomorrow again at
We will
10:30.
start.
Is that right? Rome time?
You are a guest tomorrow
I
morning
think I
again,
am, yes.
and with Christopher Wells here in studio. So yes, 10:30 Rome time tomorrow morning for another marathon
And too,
commentary.
we'll have Devin as well tomorrow in the anchor spot.
Yes.
He joined us with some great contributions from the square. So thanks to
So,
Devin.
yes,
And
thanks
especially to our guests, Philippa Hitchin and Don Prudlow, for providing so much information and insight and your memories and reflections from the various pontificates.
And being
Thank
so
you so
game
much.
for such a long,
in a
alive,
marathon session. Win it, but we
wonderful.
didn't.
And thank you to Francesca Merlo for being our great producer. And I can see out there Kelsey Gussie, who is also working away behind the scenes, and Mario Scatton. Thank you, all of you. Chiudiamo. We can, they're signaling us from the...
So we are, in fact, going to
the
finish
box.
up our broadcast now with the main event has occurred, as it were. So again, thanks to all those who participated in the evenings. Thanks to especially to our head of the English section, Linda Bordoni, who has done so much hard work to make all of this possible.
And thank you, Christopher.
And as we do close up our broadcast, I would like to thank all of our broadcast partners as well, including EWTN TV, Catholic Faith Network in America, Shalom World Television Network USA, Atmadarshan TV, Catholic TV, Mata TV India, and UCTV, Uganda Catholic Television. Also our radio partners, Luminous Radio and Radio Katipunan in the Philippines. Thanks to all of you. Please join us again tomorrow. Laudetur Jesus Christus.
Vatican Media English Channel. 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 Vatican Media, 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 English Channel. Vatican Media 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 English Channel. Vatican Media